All right. Hi, everyone. We're back. My name is Sam. I'm from The Blockhead. The Blockhead is an educational resource that talks about cryptocurrency, blockchain, and distributed ledgers in an easy, entertaining way. I originally saw that tech jargon was a big barrier to learning this type of material, and that's what I created. But today for this workshop, we're going to talk about centralization versus decentralization. If you were with us before, we spoke about foundations to finance this morning. I believe it's also a recording that you can access, and I would highly recommend watching that before we dive into today's concepts. So today will be about 35 minutes. We will be talking about centralization versus decentralization, which is essentially two different organizational structures. So centralization, we will talk about what that means, what systems are centralized that we use today, what are the benefits, and then what are the costs. Not necessarily financial costs, but perhaps the drawbacks or things that we're exchanging for the benefits that it provides. So when we really water it down, centralization is a certain type of organizational structure where there is a central authority that governs and handles the operation of that organization. So this can mean a lot of different things depending on what we're talking about, but as a broad concept, this is the definition. As you can see here, when you think of centralization, think of a triangle. So if you're with us in the Foundations to Finance workshop, you may have noticed that when we talked about things like banks, governments, credit unions, there tended to be a top-down structure where there is a group of people that perhaps are using a service, but there are a smaller group of people at the top that are actually making the decisions that perhaps run or steer the course of whatever that service is. So some different examples here, although there are many we could talk about. The first are governments. This is just an example. You have a governing body that makes decisions that affects a larger group of people. This could be a local government where you may have 10 people that are making decisions that affect a community of a couple thousand. This could be a country where you have a larger group of people or smaller group of people at the top, but still affecting a much larger majority. Government bodies could also be international, something like the United Nations, where you have a group of representatives, and each of those representatives are kind of there to represent an even larger body of people. A second example of this, which is completely different, is social media. So different websites and applications that we use today, like Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Twitter. These are things that are designed to allow people to communicate quickly. But when we actually look at those companies, they are also centralized, meaning, at the top of Facebook, you have Mark Zuckerberg. At the top of Yahoo, you have their CEO, but you also have maybe under their CEO, a C-suite of people, like a CFO, a COO, what have you. Social media is a very interesting example of a centralized organizational structure because it also has a decentralized component. And we will get into this later, but in terms of the decentralized component, this is like the audience that is using that social media service. So if we take Facebook, for example, we can see the triangle. We can see the people that work at Facebook making all the decisions that affect the people that use Facebook as a platform. But the people that are using it as a platform can interact with one another freely. So that's a very interesting hybrid example I wanted to bring up, but we'll move on to a few other centralized structures. Another is banking. So we obviously talked about this in our previous workshop if you were able to attend, but it is an organization that stores assets on behalf of people and lends out money for profit. So in this centralized structure, we have a small group of people affecting a larger group of people. They make decisions like where should we set our interest rate at if we're going to lend money out? What should we charge for people who do keep money in this bank? So they make all these little decisions that affect a greater population. And finally, and probably the most different example that I still wanted to include here, is logistics companies. So within a supply chain for a business, a lot of times you need to hire other people or services to ship and transport the goods that you're selling as a merchant to the people that you're selling to. So let's say I have a t-shirt business. I make amazing, hilarious t-shirts with cartoons on them. Now I can't myself distribute those t-shirts to the people I want to sell them to. And, clearly there's a large market of people that want to buy t-shirts with my cartoons on them. So I then seek out a company that has trucks and has transportation methods in order to get my good out to different customers, because it would be very expensive for me as a merchant to do this myself. So in order to speed up and also make the supply chain a little bit more economically efficient, I would hire a service like a trucking company to then take my goods and transport them elsewhere, whether that's going to other shops or directly to the customer themselves. So this is just an example of another centralized structure. In terms of those actual trucking companies, they own a fleet of trucks or a fleet of planes or ships or what have you, depending on how far I'm shipping these goods. And so they're the ones in control of getting these goods from point A to point B. So this is an example of a more tangible service, but it is also centralized, because what do you have? You have a small group of people, the people running this trucking company, affecting a larger community. So there are a couple attributes that are quite common with these centralized structures. First is that you have vertically aligned communication. Now, what does this mean? It means that the communication that's coming out from this organization, company, government, whichever example you use, is usually coming from the top. So even if a company like Facebook decides to put out a big message, the top of that chain, top of the pyramid, Mark Zuckerberg in Facebook's case, is going to have to approve that message for it to then be cascaded out. If the message is just internal within that organization, it's still likely to come from the top down. You're not usually going to see a small entry-level employee at Facebook be able to broadcast a message to the entire organization. So this is an example of vertically aligned communication within a centralized network. The second that this feeds into is hierarchical power. So right here, as you can even see in this little icon, the power in these structures is from the top down. So if you ever get confused, just think of centralization as a big triangle. So the power is at the top and it gets a little bit less as you disperse it. So someone at the bottom of the pyramid has much less power than someone at the top. Another thing here with centralized organizations is that they're common with large organizations. So a lot of times when you have a lot of voices, a lot of people in the room, someone needs to emerge as the leader in order to steer the direction and make more strategic decisions, which feeds into our last point here, which is efficient decision making. Why is this more efficient? Because usually if you put 100 people in a room and ask them to make a decision on something, like, do we order pizza for lunch or do we order a bunch of fruit for lunch? You're going to have a lot of different opinions in that group. There's going to be a lot of different arguments. This is a very, very basic example, but however, if you had some leaders in the room and if you had a more pyramid structure, then it would be much easier to reach a decision of if they get pizza or if they get fruit for lunch. I would probably pick pizza myself. But if it was a centralized structure, I wouldn't have a big say because maybe I wouldn't be at the top of the pyramid. Or maybe I was at the top of the pyramid, so I would actually have a bigger sway. Maybe my argument would be made and people would actually follow whatever decision I wanted. So these are some different attributes of centralized structures. They're quite basic and we can definitely get more nuanced with these, but we'll get into that later in the presentation. So there are benefits and drawbacks to any way that you decide to organize a network of people. Some benefits to centralization, as we saw in this example of a big group deciding what they need for lunch. We have some strategic decision making, and it provides control over an inadequate organization. So if you have a lot of people with a lot of opinions and a lot of noise, sometimes it's going to take a lot of time to figure out what the decision should be. So by having people at the top, it is much easier and faster to get to that. They're able to take control of the situation and then steer it in the correct direction. Another two things that are benefits of centralized structures. The first here is that it improves professional administration of sensitive and complex arrangements. So I really love the United Nations as this example because you have very complex issues like climate change, energy consumption, things like this, where this is sensitive, this is complex. It differs between every country, but by having a representative from each kind of make a decision on behalf of those communities, it's a little bit easier to make decisions and to find consensus with these more sensitive topics. Another is centralized structures maximize access to experienced personnel. So what does this mean? Well, usually when you have a centralized structure, this pyramid, the people at the top don't usually just elbow their way there. Usually they are elected or they are an expert in their field, and that's why they emerge as a follower in this organization. Now, it obviously differs. In a government, you maybe have people that are electing the person at the top. In a company like Facebook, you might have someone that proves that they are the best person for that role by interviewing with the board of directors or interviewing with different people of the organization to prove that they're the ones with the right vision and the right expertise to lead that organization. So although the people at the top can emerge in different ways, usually they're the experienced or the ones with the most expertise so that the people lower in the triangle can trust the decisions that they're going to make. Trust is a key word and something I would hang on to before we dive into decentralization. Now, with all these benefits of centralized structures, there are also some drawbacks. So while decisions can be made quickly, these types of organizations are usually a little resistant or slow to change. With a smaller group of people at the top, they see how things have always been done, they understand how things work, and they're going to be a little bit reluctant to introduce new systems or make decisions that are going to radically change the way that their organization is structured. This also feeds into the second drawback, which is that they are susceptible to agency capture or bureaucracy. What does this mean? Well, usually when you're at the top, you have some power. With power comes some politics. There usually gets some ego involved in there. Other more behavioral, psychological things tend to surface in these structures where the people at the top don't necessarily want to relinquish their power. Maybe they want to stay up there. Maybe they want to do things so that other people trying to merge and take their spot don't actually get to that spot. I think one example of this is the movie The Devil Wears Prada. In this movie, you have Meryl Streep playing a character where she is the head of a fashion magazine. She is at the top. She gets, what she says goes. She is the boss, the showrunner. And when someone from a different organization is rumored to possibly take her spot because the people that are in charge of electing that spot think that she might not be the best fit anymore, she does a lot of different things in order to make sure that she keeps her spot and that potential substitute doesn't actually get there. So that is the susceptibility to agency capture example. The other part of this is bureaucracy. Because you have things trickling from the top down, that means things can go a little bit slower and things are susceptible to something called red tape, meaning that, maybe that structure has a lot of processes in place or maybe they need a lot of approvals in order to get things done. Maybe everyone at the top has to review something before they can move forward with it, but those people are quite busy and probably high in demand. So actually reviewing and approving takes longer. So you can see how this can provide a little bit of a barrier. Another one here is high cost. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean financial cost, but high cost in the sense that it may take a lot of time, a lot of energy. It may take just a lot of effort to like run this centralized organization, having things trickle from the top down in order for this particular type of network to run. And the final drawback here that I want to touch on, although there are definitely more benefits and drawbacks to centralized structures, is that there is a single point of failure. What does this mean? A single point of failure means that in centralized structures, you have one place where the information lives. So if we take a bank, for example, the information that that bank has on the people that maybe store their money with that institution, or the people that are borrowing money from that institution and paying it back slowly, means that that bank has all of that info, but no one else has it. Why is this a problem? I think there are many problems involved in this, but the single one is that if someone wanted to hack into that system that is more common today, then they could. They could technically wipe out that, bank's database, and then no one would have a copy of that. No other party would, because these are kind of single party organizations. Another real life example of this is, say, Sony. They have a huge database of their users and customers. Within that giant spreadsheet that company has, it has, their customers' names, their addresses where they've perhaps ordered products in the past, maybe the payment information they use, like credit card information or bank information. It could have even more sensitive information than that. But a hacker was actually able to breach their database, steal all of that data, meaning then all of a sudden they knew thousands of people's names, where they were located, as well as some payment information. You can see here how this single point of failure can actually be a massive, massive problem for all the users of a particular service. So that feeds into something called decentralization. This is basically the opposite of centralization, where there's no central authority that governs and handles the network. Its power and operation is usually distributed amongst everyone. It's a little bit of a tricky concept to understand, but I think it's easier. We'll jump into a video later and then give a couple examples. So this is what it looks like in a very simple form. Now, I know these two look like really random, like molecules or something you might see in a science class, but on the left represents centralization. So here is that central governing authority, and it affects all the users within whatever that organization is. So maybe these are employees of a company, maybe they're users of a service like Facebook, but whenever that central authority makes a decision, it's affecting everyone involved. And these people don't really have the power to make those types of decisions because they're out here. So a decentralized structure is very different. And I think it's more easily understood visually than through words. But in this type of structure, the power is completely distributed. And the ones that make the decisions, it might be siloed into different areas. You might have different groups, or it might be distributed amongst everyone. Or perhaps these are the people that are helping run the network, and then these are all the different users, and they can reach each other equally. Now, we're going to watch a quick video on what decentralization is in theory. I think this will make a little bit more sense. It's much easier to view in a video setting than me just chatting your ear off. And then we will also watch a little bit longer video on decentralization in practice. So here's the first.
The world is changing rapidly, and the internet is fast entering a new technological era, as Web 2.0 gives way to an emerging set of blockchain technologies. This next generation of internet technologies, built on the blockchain, offers many interesting new technological, economic, and social innovations, such as digital currencies, distributed ledgers, blockchain IoT systems that will transform many industries from finance and insurance to energy and cybersecurity. But probably the extraordinary thing about this next generation of the internet, built on the blockchain, is that it is, as one commentator noted, an institutional technology. At the heart of social organizations and all forms of institutions is the question of how we work together by exchanging value within a trusted environment. The blockchain is technology that enables automated trust and the automated frictionless value exchange. This capacity to automate the basic workings of social institutions, coupled with increased interconnectivity, means that we increasingly have the technological means to create massive organizations that are truly distributed and automated, something we have never seen before, and whose potential is only really limited by one's imagination. This potential of the blockchain to revolutionize human social institutions is most clearly demonstrated in what are called distributed autonomous organizations that give us a glimpse into the future. Although truly autonomous, decentralized organizations are something new, they can also be seen as just one more step in a millennia-old process of institutional evolution. A process in which we have gone from organizations based fully upon the specific characteristics of their leaders within hierarchical structures to the modern bureaucratic organization to today's platform economy, where we have moved into semi-distributed organizations, where businesses operate platforms where the rules are executed by computer code automatically. In our current platform economy that has been built on Web 2.0 technologies over the past decade, organizations are a hybrid of distributed automated platform and centralized business organization managed by people. Platforms like YouTube, Alibaba, WeChat, Upwork, or Uber represent a combination of both centralized digital platform operated by a private business and distributed user-generated systems built on the platform by hundreds of millions of users. However, things are changing fast at present, and the Web 2.0 technology that created these platforms is giving way to a new era in web technology with the rise of the blockchain. Blockchain technology offers the possibility to disintermediate these platforms by creating fully distributed systems of organization without need for a centralized organization supporting the platform. With the blockchain, we now have the technology to create truly distributed organizations at a global scale, something that we previously did not have. A decentralized autonomous organization, also called DAO, is an organization that is run by rules that are created by their members through a consensus process and then written into a set of contracts that are run via computer code, thus enabling the automated management of a distributed organization. On a more technical level, a DAO is an organization that is managed through rules encoded in smart contracts and run on the blockchain. DAOs are online platform communities with their resources organized according to rules agreed in advance and set out in its code. DAOs are an open source software capable of modification through member consensus. They are currently made possible by the development of Ethereum. Ethereum is a public blockchain which works as a decentralized virtual machine for executing peer-to-peer contracts. DAOs are essentially a set of complex smart contracts that combine to form a set of rules that manage the operations of a group of members and their resources. Distributed organizations are based on a few core principles to their design, which are ultimately trying to support a self-sustaining system of organization through local feedback loops. Instead of having formal management structures monitoring and coordinating the organization from a central point, decentralized organizations work through signaling systems, which are distributed feedback loops, as means for aligning the individual with the group. Distributed organizations tackle a problem by creating an infrastructure of cooperation done through the local interactions between members and signaling systems, which are designed to create a self-organizing system. A good example of one such signaling system would be the feedback a buyer leaves for a seller on eBay, thus creating a signal to others about the seller's trustworthiness via only peer-to-peer interaction. At the heart of these distributed organizations is the idea that groups are about value as measured by some form of a token. With distributed ledgers, we can create markets out of tokens that represent whatever value system the organization is based around. It is this value, token system, and market mechanism that are at the heart of the organization. They regulate the system and define any one person's position within the group. These distributed organizations aim to be meritocratic. That is to say, a person's position in the organization is based upon the value they have contributed, as measured by the other members that they have interacted with. Their value and corresponding reputation that they have received through their interaction with other members defines their status within the community, with all of this being encoded as tokens on the blockchain. Distributed organizations try to draw upon the intelligence of many people by drawing upon their specific local knowledge. They try to avoid situations where people become overly influenced or persuaded by any highly influential member. They try to harness a diversity of perspectives from all the members. Distributed organizations try to embody the process of evolution in their design, similar to the evolutionary process that is built into our market economy. Distributed organizations work through a process whereby members create a stock of new ideas, decisions, or initiatives, and then members essentially invest their tokens into those that they believe most viable and receive rewards if the initiative is beneficial to the organization, thus mimicking the process of evolution where new varieties are created and selection is performed based upon their contribution to the whole organization. Distributed autonomous organizations are very much in their infancy. They are still just experimental. Not only do we lack the actual finished software solutions, we in many ways still lack some of the basic science required to understand the full dynamics through which self-organizing social systems can work in a stable, safe, and sustainable fashion. There are many things that can go wrong with badly designed social systems. One of the first large-scale autonomous distributed organizations was recently hacked at the cost of millions of dollars. We are still in the experimental phase of trying to understand exactly all the parameters and dynamics that are needed to make a social system self-regulating and then building these into the software. This being said, a number of distributed systems for organizational management already exist, such as Backfeed or Colony being the most often cited examples. Although such systems are still experimental in nature, their potential should not be underestimated, and they will only grow as the underlying technology develops and our understanding of distributed self-organizing systems matures. The blockchain and new distributed models of governance can play a major role in providing the trust infrastructure, the platforms, and off-the-shelf organizational solutions to massive social systems, the type that would be required to develop functioning global institutions.
All right, so maybe my voice is a little bit more entertaining than hers, but that was essentially a precursor to decentralization in theory. So she kind of touches on, there are definitely risks, but there are lots of benefits and upsides, and we're kind of entering this new era where decentralization in organizations is possible. All right. So some benefits and drawbacks that I want to touch on quickly, as I know we're getting closer to time. So some benefits here is that it can scale without limit. So while this triangular structure of centralization is a little bit more limited, decentralization can actually explode with just the power of the network. Second is that there's full control. So everyone in the system has some level of control and contribution. Third is high security. So in contrast to the single point of failure that we saw with centralization, Decentralization usually has a higher security structure because all of the data is copied and verified and then shared amongst the network. So if a hacker came in and tried to steal data, they would really have to access data from everyone in the network, meaning that it would be such a high cost for them to try and steal that information that it's actually not even worth the effort at the end of the day. On top of that, the blockchain structures that we will actually get into later in this series, I believe tomorrow, make it so that the security is amped up even further. So although in the video she alludes to a decentralized system that was hacked, and this has certainly happened in the past, things like Bitcoin are actually like super high security because of the way that it's distributed. And again, we'll get into it later, but just right now, we're just trying to understand the benefits here. Another one is that it's open and free. So these decentralized structures don't have a permission or a barrier to enter the network or community and actually start contributing. So the barrier is much lower to get involved. Now, some drawbacks. So volatility is certainly a factor. In certain decentralized structures, this can be a thing. So for something like Bitcoin, when it was in the very early days and a much smaller community, a lot of decisions were being made, a lot of conversations were happening, and what happened is that the price was very volatile. Now, in Bitcoin's case specifically, as time goes on and more people join the network, it's harder and harder to get what's called consensus, meaning that over 51% of the people agree on a decision and decide to either upgrade the network or go a certain direction. This is specific to Bitcoin. Not all decentralized structures operate this way, but something that was put into place in order to mitigate this volatility drawback. Another one I just want to touch on, I think it's important to understand these, is misuse of authority. So although everyone in the network has a say, sometimes people can actually misuse their own small shared sense of power. So let's say you have a group of people and they're trying to decide which activity they want to do on the beach, and everyone has an equal say. If one person decides they actually don't want to be any fun and they just want to sit down, that's going to be their vote no matter what. They're misusing their power. They're going against the larger decision and saying, voting in whichever way that they see fit or that they want to do, even if it goes against what might be best for the group. So that is a very simple, overgeneralized example of misuse of authority, but certainly something to keep in mind when we think about decentralized structures or even creating your own. This will also feed into why consensus mechanisms are so important. But again, let's just focus on the theory right now. Another is that there sometimes is a slower decision-making process with decentralized structures. So versus the triangle where a small group of people are making a decision, although they might have a bureaucratic process where things have to go in review and approval and like a system in place for that triangle to move forward, sometimes when an organization is decentralized, there are so many voices involved. If we think back to that example of a conference when they're deciding, do we want to have pizza for lunch or fruit for lunch? Sometimes since everyone's voice can be loud, that becomes a lot of noise and it actually slows down the process of landing on a decision. Another way of thinking about this is instead of a small group of people meeting to review a decision and make a certain verdict, instead you have a voting process, and the whole voting process can take a lot of time and energy and sometimes be slower. Fourth here is a shared burden of responsibility. So let's say that the whole group decides to go a certain direction, and that direction ended up having a negative impact on the larger community. That means that everyone who voted or everyone who had some sort of agency in this decision-making process actually shares the burden of whatever the outcome is. Now that can be positive, but it can also be negative. And I think these are things to keep into consideration as we move forward. Now, this video is decentralization in practice, but I want to keep an eye on time. I know that we have about 15 minutes until this workshop ends, and we also have some group exercises. So I think the first video is more important because we're really talking about this in theory. I will play the first part of this video that talks about a little bit actually how we've seen decentralization in the past. And once he starts to get into blockchain, then we'll continue on.
For millions of years, humans lived together in small, decentralized network communities of about 30 to 70 people. Everybody knew everybody, and it was hard to get away with doing bad things. But then, about 10,000 years ago, something happened that changed the course of history: the invention of agriculture. Agriculture allowed people to produce food on a scale they hadn't been able to before. It allowed not just a few people, but thousands and even millions of people to live together in large societies. But humans have a memory limit, known as Dunbar's number. We can only remember about 150 people well. So in these large societies of thousands and even millions of people, we could no longer remember everyone that we interacted with. There was the rise of anonymity, and anonymity threatened the social order. This created an opportunity for strong men to arise to restore social order. These strong men instituted social systems that were top-down, centralized, command and control. This kept the social order, but with great power comes great abuse. So the people that lived in these centralized societies suffered great abuses. They paid a big price. But this was the only way to organize society on a large scale. So people put up with these abuses for 10,000 years, the entire span of recorded history. Then, about 500 years ago, there was another change that started turning the tide of human history back to the decentralized society that we'd lived in for millions of years. So when you look at the whole span of human social evolution, the span of 10,000 years of centralized society, which is really all that we remember, is actually just a blip in time. It's a short transition phase that takes us from the decentralized society of our past, which was on a small scale, to a decentralized society of our future, which allows millions and billions of people to live together in a decentralized way. But what is it that allowed us to again live together in a decentralized way without those centralized structures? What is it that allowed us to bridge and transcend Dunbar's number? People-based trust systems don't scale beyond Dunbar's number, but technology-based systems scale virtually without limit. So it's technology-based, the emergence of technology-based trust systems that allowed us to organize society on a large scale without centralization. The first of these technologies was the printing press. It started with the printing press about 500 years ago. The printing press has no memory limit, and the economics of printing allowed ordinary people everywhere to cheaply record and communicate ideas across the whole world, free from the restrictions of the centralized state and the centralized church. Communicating these ideas with people freely, without censorship, inspired the first democracy movements. People started challenging the state, started challenging the church, developed their own ideas about how they could do things. But the printing press was only the first of a long series of technologies, the most recent of which are the internet and Bitcoin. I refer to all these technologies put together as the technology of trust. Where human-based trust systems don't scale, technology-based systems scale virtually without limit beyond Dunbar's number. So we can once again live together in a decentralized way, but on a large scale. The technology of trust has 4 pillars. The first of these pillars is decentralized communications. Before we can do anything, we need to communicate what we want to do. And decentralized communications has 2 essential components in the modern world: the internet and cryptography. The internet and peer-to-peer decentralized technologies such as BitTorrent are now enabling people to communicate without censorship. So centralized power structures can no longer control the flow of information. However, the internet by itself is not enough. We need cryptography, because without cryptography, the centralized structures can still use surveillance and censorship of what we communicate. And this impacts our freedom of speech, our freedom of thought. To have freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and freedom of action, we need privacy-enabled communication systems. So the internet plus cryptography gives us that. The second pillar of a decentralized society is decentralized law. So first we communicate about what we want to do, and then we come to an agreement how we want to cooperate. And for that we need decentralized law. The 3 essential components of a decentralized legal system are choice of law, choice of adjudicator, and choice of enforcer. Choice of law means that we can choose the law that applies to our agreements and our interactions. So for example, we do a contract and we can choose the law of England or the law of Switzerland, or we can even make up our own law. Choice of adjudicator means we can choose who hears our disputes, who resolves our disputes. And finally, choice of enforcer means we can choose who it is that enforces our contracts and legal judgments. These 3 principles sound like very radical ideas, but it may surprise you to hear that these are actually not untested theories. This is the original way that our legal systems operated. These ideas date from prehistory. These were the cornerstones of the legal system of our past. It's only in the past 10,000 years of increasingly centralized societies and increasingly centralized legal systems that we've gradually forgotten about these building blocks. And today, it's almost impossible for us to imagine how we could have a legal system that's decentralized in the way that I've just described. It's time to bring back these ideas and to reintroduce them into the modern world so that we can really operate a decentralized society. I and other researchers have developed a complete legal framework for a decentralized society that operates on these principles. And in fact, we're already implementing these principles and these legal systems in our businesses and in so-called startup cities. Following the examples of Hong Kong and Singapore, there are now entrepreneurs building so-called startup cities in developing countries, autonomous regions of developing countries that desperately need jobs. And we're building these startup cities with these advanced legal systems that allow people to create jobs and generate wealth on a scale that hasn't been possible in today's world. Today's world is suffering from so many laws that it's virtually impossible to do anything. And these countries desperately need jobs, they desperately need wealth creation. So these are very exciting developments. The third pillar of a decentralized society is decentralized production. Just like we've had with decentralized communications, decentralized production allows us to bypass the censorship of centralized systems. And there's 2 essential elements of decentralized production. First of all, decentralized materials production, and secondly, decentralized energy production. Decentralized materials production includes technologies such as 3D printing. With 3D printing, anyone, anywhere in the world can download a design from the internet and print this out at home, print out their own products. So this bypasses the restrictions that seek to control the flow of goods across national boundaries. The second component is decentralized energy production. We are now starting to see, we're in the early days of decentralized energy production that will allow people to produce their energy cheaply at home at virtually unlimited quantities. And together, these will move us from the systems we've had, like the days of the Pharaoh, one guy controlling an army of thousands of slaves. Today, we've got Apple having factories in China with tens of thousands of workers. This will move us to much smaller systems where people can produce their own goods and services at home without censorship. The fourth pillar of a decentralized society is decentralized finance. And the essential components of a decentralized financial system are, first, a decentralized currency, and secondly, decentralized contracting systems. The invention of Bitcoin is one of the most important breakthroughs in human history. For the first time, we have a decentralized currency that cannot be censored. It cannot be controlled by any entity, by any government. The invention of Bitcoin has sparked the emergence of a whole new digital finance industry that is building an ecosystem around Bitcoin that will develop digital financial services, goods and services, products and services. The most important of these is decentralized contracting systems. These contracting systems, for the first time, offer a complete universal transaction platform. So on a single integrated platform, you can do literally any kind of financial or legal transaction. And these two technologies put together, so decentralized currency with decentralized contracting platforms, give power to ordinary people. Today's financial system is highly centralized. A few people pull the levers of power, and we are at their mercy. A stark example of that, for example, is Cyprus. One day, people thought they had money saved up over 30, 40 years, and the next day they heard that the government was going to confiscate 40% of their assets, and there's nothing they can do about it. But with these technologies, you have the power back in your own hands. So those are the four pillars of a...
All right. So I know we're coming up on time. You can certainly watch the rest of the video on YouTube on your own if you'd like. But I think he does a really great job of detailing, what does decentralization actually look like, and why is this a new thing today? And really, Bitcoin, which introduced blockchain, now gave us the type of technology that allows us to put these systems in place. So what does this look like on an individual level? I'll quickly go through this, but essentially this gives anyone the power with an idea and a phone to incorporate a legal entity. Meaning if you have a business idea and you think it'll do well, you can build it on a smartphone and you can create it into an actual organization. Second, you can connect that to a global transaction platform to safely and securely do business with anyone in the world. So back to that crowdfunding concept that we covered in Foundations to Finance, if you make a case for yourself and for your idea, other people can get involved. They can support you and they can help you grow. The third is that the decentralized blockchains actually ensure the guaranteed integrity of this. So you're not just trusting anonymous people on the web, but smart contracts and blockchain really are the processes that bake trust into the system. So you don't actually have to trust the people on the other side. You just have to trust the technology. What this may look like is that you say you release a product, and when you release a product, perhaps certain money comes in to pay for that. The smart contract or blockchain is set up that once that first criteria is met, meaning you release the product, then the funds are able to be released into your account. the second half of the criteria. So you can see how the technology is the thing that holds the trust in this situation and actually facilitates this, which leads to this step 4. This improves the ability to generate wealth and create services that were previously unavailable, which is really kind of the star reason of why decentralization is so valuable and why we're seeing, decentralized finance, NFTs, and different distributed systems erupt at this time in Web 3.0. So what is next? I know we're about time, but essentially this question is for you because anyone can decide what comes next. Anyone has the power to create the service that they want and see where it takes them. So there is some group work. Feel free to do this on your own time, but just an exercise to think through, try and come up with different decentralized services that you could potentially create that benefit your community. Think through the benefits and then also think of the possible drawbacks to that structure. So why is decentralization particularly important to that problem or opportunity? And maybe how could decentralization benefit that? So again, thank you for taking the time to listen today. I hope it was valuable and good luck with everything. Again, my name is Sam and I'm from the Blockhead, and this concludes today's workshop.